Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. This is Dr. Wendy Williams, and today we're going to be talking about promoting generalization. This is the lecture for Chapter 19. So, I want to start this section by saying, so what next? We've talked a lot about different procedures that we can use. We've talked about token economies and positive and negative reinforcement. Differential reinforcement. We haven't talked about shaping and chaining, but we will. But these are all methods designed to create new and more adaptive behaviors. And one of the things that's really important is that we want our clients, the people that we work with, whether they're professional clients or personal friends or family, we want them to be able to take those new behaviors and use them effectively in many different ways. We want them to be able to take those behaviors and generalize them to new settings, to new situations, and to new stimuli. So what exactly is generalization? Well, the generalization is really defined as the occurrence of a target behavior in the presence of stimuli that are similar to, but not exactly like, the original discriminative stimuli used during training. So we're talking about using a behavior that we learned in one setting or in one context in a new but similar context. What we'd like to see is a class of functionally similar stimuli. So those stimuli that are all relatively similar to each other that manage to control the same behavior outside of the training situation. So we'd like to see these new and adaptive behaviors carried out beyond the training setting into new and appropriate environments, situations, and contexts. So here's an example of generalization. And my question to you is, would you respond similarly to each of these signs? Do you go in or do you not go in? And what you see here are lots of different ways of identifying the ladies' room. And these are very different stimuli, but they all fit within a class of stimuli, which would be signs for women's restrooms. So, do you go in or do you not go in? Here's another example of the same thing. You tell me, do you go in or do you not go in? Okay, not so easy. These are some much more cryptic ways of signaling men's and women's restrooms, and it's amazing to me that under the right circumstances, in the right environment, in the right setting, even something as bizarre as, and I'll use my cursor, even something as bizarre as these would still control our behavior, and we could extrapolate which door we should go through. So I think that's kind of interesting. So you might be trained originally on something that looks sort of generic, like this symbol or this symbol, but in the long run, I would like my daughter to have learned enough about which restroom to go into, that when she's faced with things like this, or faced with symbols or names that maybe are not easy to understand in foreign languages, but have some kind of image on it, that she would still be able to use those appropriate behaviors. Okay, so I would like to pause the video here for a moment and go get a YouTube video that I want to show you that shows us just how well we learn these stimuli and how powerful they are over our behavior in terms of literally knowing whether we go in or whether we do not. So this is a funny video that I saw that this actually demonstrates stimulus control and the automaticity that can come about as a result of really well-developed stimulus control. So I'll just give you a quick overview. Here's two restrooms. You have what looks like the men's restroom on the right, and it looks like the ladies' restroom on the left, and a gentleman who's about to go in. And just watch what happens. It's pretty funny. They say, oh, well, I go in here, right? Sorry. Actually quite confused. This really is kind of a cruel trick. Clearly confused. Very confused. These poor gentlemen, I feel sorry for them. This is also a good demonstration of punishment, natural contingencies as well. And now the guys are getting it, and all the girls are coming out to surprise them. Okay, that's awesome. So much for silly videos. I think that's a very funny one too. So let's talk a little bit about strategies for promoting generalization once you have a behavior that's been trained. The first is that you want to make sure that you reinforce all occurrences of generalization to appropriate other situations. You want to train skills that actually contact natural contingencies so that you don't have to follow someone around to make sure that they get reinforced for their generalizing their behaviors. Excuse me, we want them to generalize and be naturally reinforced. If we need to modify the contingencies of punishment and reinforcement before we go out into the environment, the natural environment, you may want to introduce some novel reinforcers, but then you should probably fade them before it will begin to start generalizing. You want to incorporate a wide range of relevant discriminative stimuli during training so that you want to have lots of variations on your theme of what the stimulus is. So use the entire stimulus class or a large broad spectrum from within the stimulus class. So if you're teaching women's restroom signs, you want to make sure you use lots of different variations during training so that when they encounter an unusual one, they'll be more likely to exhibit the appropriate behavior. But make sure that you include the common stimuli as well. You want to teach a wide range of functionally equivalent responses so that if there's more than one response that's appropriate, you can teach several of those functionally equivalent responses. And we'll talk a little bit about incorporating self-generating mediators of generalization as well. So whenever the target behavior occurs outside the training situation in a manner that's appropriate in response to stimuli in the environment that govern that kind of behavior, you want to make sure that you give positive reinforcement. You want to provide verbal praise or high fives. You want to award tokens if that's what you're using, if you're in a token economy. You want to use treats or jackpots. So here's an example. If you are in master's degrees in counseling, we often allow students to conduct brief therapy sessions after they do successful role-playing exercises. And the sessions are usually videotaped. So they learn the skills that they need during role play with each other as partners, and then we put them into very brief therapy sessions. And the sessions are videotaped, and the supervisor can review those videotapes from these brief therapy sessions with real clients and provide reinforcement for good generalization of counseling skills. They can provide praise and corrective feedback. That can be very effective. Some responses naturally lead to positive reinforcement in the real world. If you're training in a clinical setting and you have people who are learning to greet others with by saying, in a cheery way, hello, you're likely to it's likely to generalize very readily, because when you go out and you greet people in the same way, they're going to respond to you in a positive way as well. So other examples are things like recruiting attention from a teacher by raising your hand. It turns out that raising your hand is appropriate in lots of environments, and when you raise your hand, people will generally call on you. Asking politely for food items. When you get out into the world and you start requesting, please pass the salt in different environments, people will usually respond appropriately. Using language. If you're working with individuals who are nonverbal and you're teaching them basic language skills, once they get out in the world, they start using it, there's going to be lots of positive reinforcement for using their words rather than other kinds of gestures, for example. Now, some behaviors could also contact punishing contingencies out in the natural environment as well. So sometimes training new behavior, the new behaviors that people are acquiring can, even when they're being used in appropriate settings, they can still be met with frustration or concern from the environment. A good example of this is assertiveness training or refusal skills. Learning how to be more assertive and learning how to say no thank you often is not met with positive reinforcement. People are not usual. There are some people who are not comfortable having someone tell them no. When you're teaching sign language to individuals, for example, individuals with autism, they may try to generalize their sign language to the real world, and people don't know sign language, and as a result, it doesn't work, and so they don't get those. They don't get those positive reinforcers. They're more likely to get extinction, or they might even get funny looks, or people being rude and walking away, and so there could even be mild punishers that could come as a result. Certainly, when you're teaching small children how to avoid abduction, when they use that, it's going to be met with initially with punishment by the person trying to abduct them if they ever face that situation. Even things like lawful protest. If you are working with a group of people and you're trying to get them to, engaged in an activity. We have this thing going on right now, not in my town, the sort of the anti-KKK in Kittitas, and we can all learn about what lawful and peaceful protest looks like. But when you get out into the real world, sometimes there are people there who yell and scream at you and throw things at you, or the police might try to arrest you. And so they may not be met with positive reinforcement. They may be met by the natural contingencies in the environment, which sometimes are not always very pleasant. So you can get unpredictable responses from people in the real world. And so modeling some of that for these individuals might be part of your training so that they understand that they may not get the kind of reinforcement that they're getting in the training session when they get out, into the real world. Okay. In terms of modifying the natural environment, desirable behaviors, will continue to occur outside the training situation if they're reinforced. So one option is to modify the environment so that reinforcement is more likely to occur. So the way we do this is when we're training new behaviors, whether it's assertiveness or language or greetings or whatever it is that we're training, we may want to artificially pump up the immediate environment. So we want to go in and train care staff to watch for and deliver reinforcement for appropriate generalizations of new behaviors. We want to train teachers and parents and siblings and peers to watch for those new behaviors and make sure that they reinforce them. You can prepare settings in advance if possible. So you can set up, if part of your reinforcement is to use tangibles, little tiny, when it comes to using food with people with disabilities, that one of the reinforcers that's popular are things like Skittles, or I prefer gummy bears, and because I can cut them up and make them even smaller. So I'll take a gummy bear and cut it up into 4 or 5 pieces. And so I might prepare my setting by making sure that those gummy bears are available to the teachers, to the staff, to the parents, so that initially they're prepared to provide the same kind of reinforcement that I would provide in a training session. And you might explain to these other individuals that we want to start them off with continuous reinforcement and then gradually move to more intermittent reinforcement, and then ultimately fade these artificial reinforcers for more naturalistic reinforcers. So we can kind of prime the environment a little bit to encourage generalization. All right. Incorporating multiple exemplars and multiple settings. The more examples you use and the more settings you train in, the more likely you are to get spontaneous generalization, and the more likely you are to actually develop a stimulus class or expand your stimulus class. If the learner begins to respond to the appropriate discriminative stimuli in a variety of settings, it increases the probability that it will spontaneously emerge in a new setting to a new SD. The more times you train it in different settings with different stimuli, the more likely it will generalize spontaneously. Back in 1974, Stokes, Baer, and Jackson taught greeting responses to 2 kids with developmental disabilities that included waving. And so they were trained, wave to one staff member when he says hello, and they trained that one staff member. So it was like, wave to John when he says hello, and they learned to wave to him, and then he would wave back. And then they picked up a second person. They said, okay, so wave to Margaret when she says hello, and they learned to do the behavior with Margaret. And after training just 2 exemplars, 2 people, suddenly for these 2 kids, the waving generalized to the entire remaining 18-member staff. They began waving to all the people whenever anybody said hello. So training it once is good. Training it twice is even better. You may find there are people that you even have to train 3 or 4 or 5 times before the behavior starts to emerge on its own. Here's an example. Multiple exemplar training that samples a range of different situations and locations and settings and response variations. So Nancy Neef and some of her colleagues trained adults with developmental disabilities to use laundry facilities, to use washers and dryers, and they divided the groups in half. And half of the individuals learned to use just one washing machine and one dryer. They were taught with a single set of washer and dryer. The other half were trained using several different washers and dryers in different settings. And the results was that they got much greater generalization from the multiple exemplar group, and the people who were trained with multiple machines were more successful when they were asked to use machines that they had never seen before. They were much more likely to be successful. So a good example of general case programming is what we call that. Incorporating common stimuli. Another feature to promote generalization is to include features or stimuli common to the generalization settings. So you might have to start out with sort of artificial versions, and you want to, before you put people out into the environment, you want to use more naturalistic, more common-looking discriminative stimuli. Make some aspects of the training setting similar to the testing setting. Use some realism. Try to create it looking like basic skills training in a setting that looks like a real setting. I recently did, a couple years ago with one of my grad students, I did a study looking at helping young children, kindergartners, to seek help when they get lost in a grocery store. And so we built and created a simulated grocery store in one of our classrooms here in the psych department. So using realism can help that transfer of training to the transfer of generalization of skills to a realistic setting. This has been done with assertiveness training, so using novel people, using settings that are like the ones where the clients actually work, doing role playing with novel bosses or colleagues who respond to assertiveness training with a variety of responses would be good. Using role-playing with real props can really help. So the more you can incorporate naturalistic stimuli into your training session, the more likely you are to get generalization later. Teaching functionally equivalent behaviors is important. Often different responses are functionally equivalent. They do the same thing, they have the same purpose. So, for example, there are many different kinds of door handles. There are door handles that turn, there are door handles that are knob-based, that are button-based, that are levers. Think about all the different kinds of vending machines and how you get things out of a vending machine. Training lots of those different kinds of responses in order to get the same consequence. If you have a problem behavior, you can use differential reinforcement to teach or strengthen a more appropriate, functionally equivalent behavior to earn that same reinforcer. So we've talked about this before. We could practice working on replacing aggression toward a teacher in order to escape from a difficult task, to raising your hand and requesting a break to get the same outcome, an escape from a difficult task. If you do that with a variety of individuals and use raising your hand as the alternative behavior, you have a functionally equivalent response. You can get rid of the old one, replace it with the new one of raising your hand to make a request, and then when they need something in another environment, they're less likely to use aggression and more likely to raise their hand to request something. Same thing with tantrums to get attention, asking for assistance or approval for a completed task. So learning to use your words and request attention rather than using inappropriate behavior. And if we teach it in several different versions and the consequences are the same, in each case we escape from a difficult task or we get attention from the teacher, whatever it is, then later it's more likely to generalize to another teacher, to another environment, at home. You'll see more generalization. Self-generated mediators. This sounds really complicated, but it actually isn't. A mediator of generalization is basically a stimulus that's owned and operated by the client, so it's something that they actually have. So you create an artificial but portable prompt that the client can take with them and carry with them at all times. So it could be a trinket, it could be a little picture, it could be a piece of jewelry, it could be a sticky note, it doesn't really matter, but a recording sheet on the fridge. And so this is something that they've created that they can self-record or use as a self prompt to get the behavior going, to remind them to engage in their new behavior. And then finally, there are several implementation strategies for generalization. The first is to identify the target stimulus situation in which the behavior is going to be important. So know where this behavior is going to be used and identify that and use what you know about that situation or that setting to help build your training setting. Identifying natural contingencies that will be available after the behavior generalizes, and then incorporating similar contingencies in your training. Third, implementing appropriate strategies to promote generalization. So what I want to say here is just stack the deck in your favor. Do as many of these things as you can. Use incorporate naturalistic reinforcers. Incorporate self-generated mediators, prompts that they carry with them to remember. It's kind of like a string around your finger or a rubber band around your wrist. Make sure that you train many different members of the stimulus class as the stimulus prompt. So the things that make you, when you're riding your bicycle, things that make you stop before crossing the street. So stoplights, stop signs, red lights on the back of cars, all of those would be part of that stimulus class that controls whether or not you stop on your bicycle. So you want to use all of these ideas to stack the deck in your favor so that you are very confident that when the opportunity arises, your client will use the new behavior that you've trained in your training setting in a naturally occurring environment. And then finally, keeping track of generalization, actually going out with your clients into the environment and watching the opportunities present themselves in order to determine whether or not that behavior has generalized. I'm currently working right now with a graduate student who is trying to get young children with who are on the autism spectrum to use their words to request an item that's present but that they can't get to. Specifically, he used a spoon, so they engaged in several activities that required a spoon, and when they got to the point where they needed the spoon, the child needed to request the spoon and say, "Oh, spoon, please." During training, they did lots of activities. They made sundaes, and they made self-erupting volcanoes. They made a drink that they stirred with a spoon. So they had several activities, and they each learned, there were 3 children, and they each learned to request the spoon at the appropriate moment during training. But the test wasn't in the training session. The test was to put them into a play environment and have them engage in different activities and count the number of opportunities when they needed a spoon and did or did not request it. So seeing whether they would take that behavior trained in the little private classroom into a play setting to see whether or not it would be used in a play setting. So, and one of the things that we had to do was to measure generalization. We had to keep track. We had to go out into the play environment and watch to identify opportunities to use a spoon and mark down an opportunity occurred and whether or not the child actually requested it. So gathering data on generalization is a really big, important thing that you need to do if you're going to be an intervention specialist. Because remember, data is how you determine whether or not your treatment is working, and it also justifies to your clients that behavior is actually changing and improving. So with that, I'm going to stop and let you finish your studying for Quiz 5. Best of luck, and we'll see you at the beginning of the next unit. Take care.